So when we consider how we're going to provide the key nutrients, we look at the common feedstuffs. So what are the common feedstuffs used when determining a horse's ration? It really depends on where you live. What is common in some regions of the country are not common in others. And if the common feedstuffs aren't available or aren't appropriate for your particular situation, you'll probably turn to alternative feedstuffs. It's important to get to know the feedstuffs in your area, their nutrient content, as well as any specific characteristics that would have a positive or potentially a negative impact. Regardless, when choosing a feedstuff, the goal is to select those that altogether, in combination, will meet the horse's essential key nutrient requirements and in such a way that no harm comes to the horse. Those are the primary take-home messages from this discussion. It's possible to meet the energy requirements of a horse by feeding it exclusively cereal grain, oats, corn, barley. You would be meeting the horse's protein requirement as well. However, to do so would be to ignore the design of the horse's gastrointestinal tract, the fact that the horse's foregut would have the burden to digest and absorb the energy and protein from the cereal grains, which because of the amount that would have to be fed, it couldn't do without having an overflow of cereal grains that could not be digested in the foregut, but would overflow into the hindgut, and there cause major disruption of the microbial population and ultimately making the horse really sick. So I stress that the selection of a feedstuff that make up the horse's ration has to meet all of the essential key nutrient requirements in such a way as to be compatible with the gastrointestinal tract physiology. I'm going to start with water. I consider water to be the most important nutrient. Others will have different opinion perhaps, but in my opinion they would be wrong. While there isn't an alternative to water, there are quality issues that you should consider. Water should be clean. It should be temperate, ideally between 44 and 64 degrees Fahrenheit, just because that optimizes how much water a horse will drink, and that's kind of the goal. And should always be available in order to encourage drinking. The goal is to maximize water consumption. You can make sure your horse always has water by, you can give them water in a trough, access to a water trough. In the summer, that would need to be cleaned frequently to remove any debris like leaves and prevent algae growth and accumulation. Some types of algae produce toxins which can make your horse sick, and even if that isn't the case, if you don't have that type of algae in your trough, the taste can reduce water intake. In the winter, at least in the upper Midwest, in Minnesota, you'll need to use something like a thermostatically controlled water heater. Horses will drink less ice-cold water than they will slightly warmer water. There's been a lot of work done on this. So you don't want to just break the ice off the trough or off the bucket and offer them water and expect them to drink as much, because they simply won't. If you don't use a water trough, you might provide access to water by using heated automatic waters. That can be really convenient. They have some that monitor how much the horses consume, which is optimal, although it's of less value in a group setting because you don't know which horse is drinking how much. Or another method, you could give the horse access to a natural source of water when the temperature allows. So they could be drinking out of a creek, like you see up here in this picture up in the upper right. The problem with that, it looks very natural and very pleasant. Possible contamination due to feces or urine from other animals might be in the water, or from runoff from manure or fertilizer in neighboring areas upstream. Again, you could have some algae bloom during the hot weather. Not a good way to clean a creek to keep it algae free. You also run the risk of suspended sand particles. So if the water is moving water over a sandy bottom, there's going to be some amount of sand that gets suspended in the water, and when the horse drinks that water, it could actually be ingesting sand, which can settle in the horse's gastrointestinal tract and build up over time and perhaps cause sand impaction colic. The variability in which horses suffer from sand impaction colic, very good bit, but the goal really is to minimize or eliminate sand consumption. And also, when you're trying to allow access to water to something like a creek or a pond, the physical deterrents such as excessive mud at the edge of the water can cause some problems. The next thing we usually consider is how to provide energy to the horse. The most common feedstuff used to provide dietary energy to the horses are forages. The common forages fed to horses are grasses and legumes. They may be fresh pasture forage or dried forages, such as traditional hay and bales or chopped hay cubes or hay pellets. We typically think of legumes as having more energy than the grass forages, but the maturity of the plant has the biggest impact on its energy content. So you could have an immature grass that would have more energy than a very, very mature legume. If you have a horse that is an easy keeper, or kind of a pasture potato kind of thing, where they're not doing much of any work, you might choose the lowest energy forage, which would be mature grass. Again, either fresh or dried. If you have a horse that is on the other end of the energy spectrum, maybe a horse that is working hard or is thin, needs to gain weight, or it's a mare that's in lactation, you might choose the highest energy dense forage that you could, which would be an immature legume, such as alfalfa. While an immature energy-dense legume will meet most horses' energy requirements, there are exceptions. If that is the case, it'll be obvious. The horse will be thin. It's eating all the immature legume hay, alfalfa hay that it's able to eat, but it's still underweight. If the energy content is higher than what the horse needs, on the other end, the horse will gain weight and become fat. The next thing we usually consider when looking at feedstuffs is how to provide energy. And the most common feedstuff used to provide dietary energy to horses are forages. The common forages fed to horses are grasses and legumes. They can be fresh or dried. Dried would be like in your traditional hay in bales, or chopped hay cubes, hay pellets. We typically think of legumes as having more energy than grass forages, but the maturity of the plant has the biggest impact on its content, energy density content. If you have a very mature, if you have a very mature legume plant, it will actually have less dietary energy than an immature grass plant. So, in addition to the species of the plant, the level of maturity plays a key role. If you have a horse that is an easy keeper, or a pasture potato, it's not doing much work, you might choose the lowest energy dense forage, which would be a mature grass. Again, it could be either fresh or dried. If you have a horse that is on the other end of the energy need spectrum, maybe a horse that is working hard or is thin, maybe a mare that's in lactation, you might choose the highest energy dense forage, which would be an immature legume, such as alfalfa. While an immature energy dense legume will meet most horses' energy requirements, there are exceptions. If that's the case, it'll be obvious. The horse will become thin. If the energy content is higher than what the horse needs, the horse will gain weight and become fat. So what are some of the advantages of feeding forages, either fresh or dried? Forages provide the necessary bulk or fiber that stimulates peristaltic movement of the gastrointestinal tract, which keeps digestion moving right along. It's very important. Forages also aid in maintaining that hindgut environment that's conducive to a healthy microorganism population. And forages in various stages of fermentation in the hindgut enhance water retention. During times when drinking water is not available but needed in order to hydrate the body proper, water is drawn from the hindgut water reservoir as needed. In addition to how well forages support the functions of the gastrointestinal tract, eating forages, small amounts over extended periods of time, are consistent with the natural behavior of horses. An almost continuous intake of forage stimulates saliva production because of all the chewing required. The pieces of forage, when swallowed, forms a low-density mat that float at the top of the stomach contents, which serves as a physical barrier between the acid secretions in the lower portion of the stomach and the upper regions, which don't have the same protective mechanisms. Horses really, really want to forage, and here I use the term as a verb. You see, especially the same as lower right-hand picture, is what appears to be a fairly well-fed horse that is insistent on foraging and trying to graze even through a pretty significant snow cover. The good news is that when they are eating their harvested or fresh forages, the horses aren't eating your barn or your fence rails or another horse's tail. Horses are gregarious in nature. When grazing on pasture in a group setting, not only are they moving from place to place, but they're able to socialize with each other, form relationships, which helps support their mental health. If either the type or amount of forage is not sufficient to meet your horse's energy requirements, you can use some cereal grains, either individually or as a part of a commercially prepared product to supplement your forage. And in fact, the primary role of oats and corn or barley or wheat when it's incorporated into a horse's ration, whether fed alone or a mixture or in a commercial product, is to provide energy. And then energy is in the form of starch. You can see in the image in the lower left-hand corner here a micrograph of starch granules. Starch is made up of thousands of linked glucose molecules. The digestive enzymes in the foregut of the horse breaks those links between those glucose molecules, releasing glucose monomers into the lumen of the tract, which can then be absorbed across that gastrointestinal tract wall and to be used by the horse as a source of energy. The recommended amount of cereal grains like oats and corn to be fed at any one meal ranges from 0.2 to 0.5% of the adult horse's body weight. Note that I said the recommended amount for an adult horse. It is quite different for young growing horses because their gastrointestinal tract is still developing. So for a 1,000-pound horse, 0.2 to 0.5% of body weight translates into 2 to 5 pounds of cereal grain, like oats or corn or barley, at any one time or any one meal. If you feed more than that, you would feed multiple times. Those meals would then need to be spread out throughout the day to give the foregut enough time to digest and absorb the glucose from the starch in those grains fully before you would feed an additional meal of cereal grains. You have to be asking, how can there be such a broad range of how much you can feed at one time? And the answer is that the 0.5% is considered the absolute maximum that should be fed without risk of overflow into the hindgut. So if you feed more than 0.5%, so it'd be like more than 5 pounds of a cereal grain, a high-starch cereal grain in a meal, there is the risk that the foregut will not have the capacity or the time to digest and absorb the glucose in the starch in that grain. And instead, some of that grain will overflow into the hindgut and provide a source of starch to the microorganism population there, which is disruptive. What different equine nutritionists consider optimal? The optimal is less than the 0.5%, but is it 0.2%? Is it 0.3%? Is it 0.4%? There's some variation, but somewhere in that range. Depends on who you talk to. If you're feeding a commercial product, you would follow the feeding directions on the feed tag or feed bag, since while it may contain cereal grain, it may also contain other feedstuffs which dilute the starch load in that cereal grain. It's quite common for commercial products to contain non-starch ingredients, so the absolute amount that can be fed at one time could be different than if you were feeding straight corn or straight oats. Another source of energy for your horse's ration would be fats. Fats contain 2¼ times the energy content of carbohydrates and occurs naturally in forages and cereal grains. And as such, fats are a very dense source of energy. However, neither common forages nor cereal grains contain a lot of fat. Forages contain somewhere around 3% fat naturally. Cereal grains contain somewhere around 4 to 5% fat. You can use supplemental fat sources if you want additional fat in your horse's ration. It can be added a couple different ways. You can supplement it as an oil. Using oil can be a little bit messy. You have to make a choice of oil, and there's a lot of discussion on which oil is best to be used. But oil has to be kept cool in the summer to avoid rancidity, and it has to be kept warm in the winter to avoid freezing. So it's not something you probably would just keep out in your unheated stable. Another supplemental source of fat would be dry granular fats that you see here. Dry granular fats are solid and fairly stable and easy to use, and sometimes horses prefer the dry granular fats over the oil, probably as much as anything because of the texture. There are commercially prepared grain mixes, you see an example of here, that are formulated to provide extra energy as fat. Sometimes it's by the addition of an alternative feedstuff such as rice bran, because rice bran tends to be higher in fat than the cereal grains, or is higher in fat than the cereal grains. And in those feeds, the fat content on the feed tag may say 6 to 10% fat. Fats are really an excellent source of energy for the horse for a couple reasons. They are readily digestible in the foregut. They are safe to be fed up to about 20% of the total diet by weight on a dry matter basis, although that would be really high, and the typical recommendation is to supplement up to about 7% fat. What makes fats handy for the individual horse owner is that the addition of fat doesn't distort or imbalance a ration that has otherwise been formulated to meet the horse's nutritional requirements. Supplemental fat adds energy to the ration, nothing else. No worries about vitamin or mineral excess. With that said, if your horse doesn't need more calories, it doesn't need fat, supplemental fat in its diet. The fat content of the traditional feedstuffs, albeit low, is sufficient to meet the non-energy fat requirements of the horse. There are times when the more common feedstuffs the horse needs can't be fed. Sometimes it's as straightforward as you don't have the pasture, so your horse can't graze, or you might not have the space to store a lot of hay during the winter months, which may make finding a consistent source of hay challenging. Or it might be because of cost. A bad hay year can really impact the bottom line in terms of feed costs, which are usually the biggest expense of horse ownership. Or maybe hay is available, but the quality is bad. It's moldy, it's dusty, ditch hay. Then, of course, there are the special needs horses, those that for a variety of reasons can't be fed the common feedstuffs. What alternatives are available? Examples would include what have been classified as superfibers, such as beet pulp, rice bran, and soybean hulls. Superfibers are characterized as having a digestible energy equivalent or greater than the common forages. They are readily fermented in the hind gut and have a low starch sugar content compared to, say, your cereal grains. Superfibers can be used as a partial replacement for a significant amount of the common forages in horses' ration. Here you see the images of the beet pulp and rice bran and soybean hulls, and maybe what at first glance what seems obvious is that the texture of the superfibers may not be too appealing to the horse. When these are incorporated into the horse's ration, they're usually pelleted or processed in some way to make them more palatable. Please note that while soybean hulls are really fermented in the hindgut, oat hulls and rice hulls are not. You will see rice hulls and oat hulls on the ingredients of some commercial products, and they are there to provide bulk in the diet, which is really important in, say, a senior diet, but they are not readily digestible and are not intended to contribute to the energy needs of the horse. Peanut hulls may be contaminated with aflatoxins and are not recommended in horse feeds. Another alternative to the more common forage or forage plus green ration is the use of a complete feed that you see here. A complete feed is a mixture of forages and grains that are typically processed, pelleted, for example, to make them more palatable. They tend to be quite uniform, meeting all the horse's nutritional needs with the exception of probably water and salt. They can be fed with hay to prolong the period of time the horse is consuming feed, but what you want to do is very carefully follow the feeding directions on the bag or the feed tag of the complete feed so that you are feeding sufficient quantities to know that you're meeting all the horse's key nutrient requirements. If you only feed half of what they recommend and you're feeding some hay and nothing else, you're feeding half of what that horse needs in terms of vitamins, trace minerals, etc. You need to follow the feeding directions. If forages or forages in combination with cereal grains or some of the alternative feedstuffs have been incorporated into the horse's ration to meet the energy needs, then the next step is to consider the protein requirement. And if the feedstuffs already incorporated into the ration meet that protein requirement or not. Forages, which should make up the bulk of the ration, have a wide range of protein content based on both the species and the maturity of the forage. When a pasture is kept in an immature vegetative state, the protein content can be quite high for both grasses and legumes. You see in images here, grasses and legumes in a vegetative state. Hays are typically harvested at a later stage of maturity. Remember an earlier slide where it showed you how maturity increases over time and the quality of the forage decreases over time. And hays are usually harvested a little bit later in the maturity stage, increases the yield. And in those circumstances, protein content as a percent of the total would be somewhat less. Legumes will have a higher protein content than do grasses on average at a similar maturity. Because of the broad range of possible protein content, a hay analysis is recommended so you know for sure whether your forages are meeting your horse's protein requirements. Cereal grains tend to be a lot more consistent in their protein content than, say, do forages. And because of that, you can usually use a book value for cereal grain protein content. So you can look up in the tables in the NRC or probably online and say, what is the average protein content of corn, oats, barley, and rye. Depending upon the activity level, forages can usually meet your horse's protein needs, but it may be necessary to provide an additional source. If your horse needed additional protein and energy, you may choose a cereal grain. If your horse needs protein but not additional calories, then you might choose an alternative source of protein or a protein supplement. A source of supplemental protein might be soybean meal, corn gluten meal, cottonseed meal, linseed meal, safflower meal. You get the idea. In each of these instances, the oil has been extracted for probably a different use, and was left, the meal, can be used as a protein supplement, where a protein supplement is defined as containing more than 18% protein. You might choose to add soybean meal. It's the most common source of supplemental high-quality protein that is used in livestock rations. In species in which the individual amino acid requirements for growth are known, feeding value of soybean meal is considered the standard to which other protein sources are compared. However, if protein is all you need to add to an exclusively forage ration, then adding soybean meal can be a bit of a challenge. You wouldn't need much of it, but it's finely ground powder that isn't very palatable. It's quite probable that your horse wouldn't just eat soybean meal alone, although I realize that there are some horses that will eat almost anything. If you're feeding a cereal grain and you add the ground soybean meal to it, it will sift out, settle to the bottom of the feed pan, and the horse will pick around it, leave it behind. If you're feeding a grain mix to which something sticky, like dried molasses, has been added, you could probably add the soybean meal. But if the grain with the molasses is a commercial product, it's likely already incorporated or contains enough protein already, or it has been a supplemental protein source has been incorporated into the mixture. An alternative source of protein are those same superfibers that I mentioned as partial replacement of forages. So if your forage is lacking in sufficient protein, which is unusual, but it does happen, then you might go to a superfiber. Beet pulp contains on average 10% protein, rice bran 15% protein, soybean hulls 13% protein. So substantial. Again, superfibers are usually processed in some way in order to make them more palatable. Recall, we don't know the horse's optimal dietary amino acid profile for its ration. However, one approach is to match the dietary profile with the amino acid profile of the horse itself. The assumption has been that the profile, quantities, and ratios of the essential amino acids in the muscle tissue of the horse will provide an insight into what should be in the horse's ration. While on some level this makes sense, when you factor in the short-lived and long-lived proteins and the constant degradation and synthesis of proteins in the horse's body, it is at best an educated guess. And I stress the word guess. There are protein supplements obtained from animals, such as fish meal, milk proteins, etc., that may be a closer match to the amino acid profile in the horse per se. However, the animal-based protein sources tend to be less palatable to the horse, and then be other health risks associated with those, and they aren't usually recommended. You want a protein that provides an essential amino acids. You want the protein that provides them in the amount and ratios to each other that is optimal for growth and development and maintenance of body tissues. But right now, we don't know either the absolute amounts or the ratios of the amino acids for the horse. Researchers are still working on that. So what happens is we tend to provide an excess of protein with a goal of meeting all the individual amino acid requirements. Usually, we overfeed. Unless the horse has kidney problems, that's not typically a major health problem. Excess amino acids are disassembled, the amino group is ultimately excreted in the urine, and the carbon backbone portion of the amino acid is used inefficiently as an energy source. So, the typical approach is to feed a little bit of extra protein, hoping to meet the requirements, with the expectation that the excess will be eliminated and not pose any problems. And that's usually a fairly valid assumption. Since all minerals, both major and trace, are essential, they must be included in the horse's ration. To do so can be a bit of a challenge because the mineral content of forages in particular is quite variable, and forages make up the bulk of the horse's ration. Differences in mineral content may be due to the fertility, type, and mineral content of the soil, the particular plant species, and even the variety within the species, as well as the maturity of the plant. Superimposed on those factors is the impact of the climatic conditions. Taken all told, it makes calculating the amount of mineral the horse is actually getting difficult. Even so, the concentration of some minerals are more consistent than others. While book values or averages taken from the literature of major mineral content in cereal grains can be used with reasonable confidence, it is always recommended that the major minerals, calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, potassium content of the forages be analyzed in a laboratory. These are usually a regular part of a typical forage analysis. Sodium and chloride may be provided as salt, and the sulfur requirement is met by the sulfur-containing amino acids that are part of the dietary protein. The situation for trace minerals is different, however. The variability of trace mineral content in forages and cereal grains is large and can vary from one area to another, even within the same field. Consequently, since it may not be possible to obtain a representative sample for analysis, they usually aren't sent off to the lab. Rather, knowing that trace minerals are critically important to the horse's well-being and the safety margin associated with the recommended amounts is fairly broad, the recommendation is to always provide supplemental trace minerals. So what are the supplemental sources of trace minerals? You can go with the free choice or ad libitum access to the supplement. That can be accomplished by using a trace mineral salt, either as a block or as a loose salt. You can also use a protein tub that contains trace minerals. In each of these cases, the idea is the horse will self-limit their consumption based on the amount of salt they will voluntarily consume, which is on average between 1 and 2 ounces a day. Another approach is to feed a trace mineral fortified commercial grain mix. When would you do that? If you need to provide extra energy anyway, then purchasing a product that has had the trace minerals added makes sense. Alternatively, if your horse doesn't need the extra calories, you would choose to feed a ration balancer, which is a commercial available concentrated form of minerals, usually in a forage pellet base that's very palatable. Think 1 a day mineral pill. Trace minerals can be provided on an individual basis as a part of a nutraceutical supplement. There are a couple key points to keep in mind. First, horses need minerals in their diet, their ration, and the best source for the trace minerals specifically are trace mineral supplements. Point 2, the mineral content of the trace mineral supplement varies a lot from supplement to supplement. Each company has their own recipe for the minerals they include in their product. Next time you're at the feed store, look at the feed tags on just the trace mineral salt blocks alone. There are similarities and there are differences. Then compare the feed tag information on the trace mineral salt block with the feed tag on the commercial grain mix as well as on the ration balancer, always keeping in mind how much of each product the horse would be eating. If they're eating less of it, the minerals need to be more concentrated. If they're eating more of it, the minerals need to be less concentrated. But even aside from those observations, different companies formulate their products differently. And that brings us to our last nutrient category, the vitamins. Water-soluble vitamins don't have to be included in the ration under normal conditions. The microbes in the hindgut and the horse's own tissues will make the water-soluble vitamins that the horse needs. If you feed them too, that's okay. The excess will simply be excreted in the urine and the sweat. Water-soluble are not retained in the body. If they're not being used or needed, they're just eliminated. It's not a problem. It's a completely different story for the fat-soluble vitamins. Those that are essential need to be included in the horse's ration. The horse and the microbes don't make those. Vitamin E and beta-carotene, which is the precursor to vitamin A, are in plentiful supply in fresh vegetative forages. Because they are fat-soluble, the excess vitamin A and vitamin E will be stored in the lipid in the horse's body when the horse consumes more than it needs, say during the summer when it's on pasture. So those extra vitamin A and vitamin E is stored in the lipid in the horse's adipose tissue and in the liver. The process of harvesting forage, sun-drying it, and baling it along with storing results in a very significant decrease in the amount of vitamin E and beta-carotene that is available to the horse, while the amount of vitamin D content actually increases. Within a short period of time, the amount of vitamin E and the beta-carotene in the hay is no longer sufficient to meet the horse's requirements. The horse will then draw to a limited extent on the vitamins stored in their bodies, in those lipid tissues from maybe when they were on pasture and during the summer. But when that reservoir in the body is exhausted, supplemental vitamin A and E is needed for the horse not to be in deficit. If it isn't included in the horse's ration, the horse that is no longer grazing fresh vegetative pasture will be deficient in vitamin A and E. Well, once again, until they can get pasture again, and have access to fresh vegetative forage. For horses that do not have access to pasture at any time of the year, there is no renewal, especially of vitamin E. So that horse becomes and stays deficient for long enough, you will have tissue damage occur. Vitamin K is produced by microbes in the hind gut and is absorbed across the gastrointestinal tract, meeting the horse's vitamin K requirements. Vitamins are incorporated into the horse's ration in some of the same ways that minerals were. While vitamins are not found in trace mineral salt mixes, vitamins are sometimes added to vitamin, mineral, protein tubs, where the salt, again, controls intake. Vitamins are found in commercial grain mixes, in ration balancers, and in some nutraceutical supplements. Specific product-based feeding instructions are provided for the commercial products. Again, keep in mind that the vitamin content of the various vitamin supplements vary substantially, both within and across sources. Not all products contain the same amount of fat-soluble vitamins. The information will be on the feed tag. Not all feeding recommendations for commercial products will actually meet a horse's vitamin requirement. So what can we say in review? The most common feedstuffs are the forages, which provide energy, protein, major minerals, and some of the fat-soluble vitamins. An alternative to the forages you see here are the superfibers, which again provide energy, protein, and major minerals, but no fat-soluble vitamins. Keep in mind that while this slide focuses on the essential key nutrients, both the forages and the superfibers also contribute to the bulk and fiber that is necessary to maintain gastrointestinal tract health and function. The primary contribution of cereal grains is energy, and to a lesser extent, protein. And while the energy contribution can be readily matched by supplemental fats, that you see over here as an alternative, protein content, it cannot be. Ration balancers are concentrated sources of major and trace minerals, as well as fat-soluble vitamins and salt. Salt is a common feedstuff, which even if incorporated into a feedstuff, should also be provided free choice. The last category of alternative feedstuffs are the complete feeds that you see here. And they are comprised, have a forage component that you see coming in here, probably a grain component, which you see here, added to trace minerals and fat-soluble vitamins that you see coming in here to provide all of these, and should provide, with the addition of salt and water, meet all of the horse's nutritional requirements. When choosing feedstuffs, we follow an order, considering what is needed to fulfill the requirements for energy, protein, minerals, and vitamins. What we choose is based on a lot of criteria: availability, price, storage space, but the choices have to conform to satisfy both the essential key nutrient requirements by also being compatible with the gastrointestinal tract physiology.